In the vast wilderness of Appalachia, where ancient ridges pierce morning mists and hollers swallow sound itself, something moves between the trees. What begins as simple but tragic missing persons reports transforms into something far stranger. A tapestry woven from police reports, Native American prophecies, and encounters that defy explanation entirely. Are these feral humans driven to wilderness by isolation and madness? What is the reality behind the occasional rumor? Today, we try to explore these answers. We've talked about Appalachian Unsolved a couple times. We'll have links to those videos down below. This one is a bit different. Today, we seek to dispel the myth and potentially unmask the mystery with an explanation, not exactly reaching for the stars or by manifesting interdimensional time-traveling creatures, as much as I'd like to do that, but rather an explanation that is grounded in tragedy that is all too human. Perhaps one of the most profound mysteries of the modern era is the scale at which national forests and national parks absorb people into their deep, long shadows cast by their dense canopies where they are never seen again or sometimes found impossibly far from where they first vanished. These statistics paint an unfathomable story. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people have disappeared from national parks since record keeping began. The Grand Canyon alone, while not in Appalachia, estimates over 1,000 disappearances since 1928. Back east, we have the Great Smoky Mountains, a region of Appalachia shrouded by swaths of dense fog that obscure its peaks and valleys. The Smoky Mountains see roughly 100 search and rescue operations annually. But it isn't the deaths that are haunting. Obviously, very tragic, but there's an end, there's a completeness to those stories. It's the ones who simply vanish as if the mountains themselves swallowed them whole. That's where the horror of that mystery comes in. With over 500,000 acres covering more than 800 square miles of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, you could search for multiple lifetimes and never find a trace of someone who's gone missing. There are so many caverns and closed-off mines in Appalachia, and there's a possibility that some of the people that go missing maybe just go to these places and then they just can't get out. There's a reason that you're not supposed to go there, and maybe it's because there's mole people living in it or whatever. If you see Appalachian content online, it probably has something to do with don't go in the woods at night in Appalachia. If you hear your mom call your name, don't follow it.
If you hear a fart, run. If you see a dog doing the Macarena on its hind legs at 3 in the morning on your Ring doorbell camera, that is not a dog.
The mystery runs quite deep. And one theory is that there are people that behave more as animals than humans who live in the Appalachian Mountains that are the reason for the disappearances. On the morning of June 24th, 2009, the mist still clung to the hollers of Turkey Creek, Kentucky, when Nancy Ann Lockhart vanished from existence. The 33-year-old single mother of 2 young boys was last seen at her late father's home in the remote Nosbin Fork area. Nancy was 5'11", just a foot shy of the editor of my YouTube channel, Tara. I shouldn't. Her grotesque physique. That's so mean. She was a woman who would be hard to miss in the small community nestled 20 miles northeast of Pikeville near the West Virginia border. We have an image of a map to give you guys an example of where that is. Her body bore the artwork of her life, a cartoon tiger on her right shoulder blade, a butterfly on her right breast, and the name Brooklyn adorning her right ankle and multiple piercings that reflected her vibrant and fun personality. But on that June morning, all traces of Nancy Lockhart would disappear as completely as morning fog in the Kentucky sun. The last person to see Nancy alive was her boyfriend, Chris Chouinard. According to his account, they had argued that morning and Nancy had stormed off, never to return. And the search efforts began immediately. Kentucky State Police Post 9, led by Detective Amos M. Adkins, coordinated with the Pike County Sheriff's Department and local volunteer fire departments. All-terrain vehicles climbed the steep hills surrounding Nancy's home. Specially trained bloodhounds were brought in from Lexington, their handlers hoping to catch even the faintest scent trail, but the dogs found absolutely nothing. There was no trace of the woman who had lived her entire life in those Kentucky mountains. The Turkey Creek area itself presented a formidable landscape for any search operation, which is a consistent theme amongst the missing in these types of areas. The unincorporated community sat in terrain characterized by steep mountainsides, dense forests, and countless hollers where a person, a body, whatever, could disappear forever. And the post office in the area had closed in 1996, leaving the area even more isolated. It's It's classic Appalachian wilderness. Beautiful, remote, but unforgiving. Unfortunately, due to the community's isolation, much of the reporting on her disappearance from 2019 hasn't been updated or maintained and is largely inaccessible, aside from information shared in missing persons groups and forums where online communities have attempted to find answers for her. Some details would seemingly indicate her boyfriend, who last spoke to her and reported she didn't return after their fight, may have played a role in her disappearance, but this obviously was never confirmed and is just speculation online. A witness involved with the missing's family in the search efforts at the time reportedly saw Chris Chouinard and a friend loading a van with garbage bags and a rug from the home, and then that same friend later allegedly purchased a new van. So that is some kind of witness allegation and some of the very small amount of information about this case that's online. Family members, though, insisted Nancy would never abandon her two young sons, especially while still grieving her father's death the previous year. The psychological profile didn't fit a voluntary disappearance. This was a devoted mother whose world revolved around her children entirely. What's strange is that Nancy Lockard wasn't the only mother to vanish from Pike County in 2009. Just 3.5 months earlier, on March 1st, a 24-year-old Crystal Branham Hall had disappeared from her apartment while on the phone with a friend. While on the phone, she reportedly told her friend that someone was coming into the back door, but then the line went dead. And like Nancy, Crystal was a mother whose family insisted she would never abandon her children. In this case, she had 3. And a page dedicated to her on Facebook is still active, with one of her sons, Ethan Hall, posting as recently as August 4th, yesterday, to remember her. The geographic proximity and temporal closeness of these cases suggest to some investigators the possibility of a serial predator operating in Pike County. Nobody has ever been charged, as no body or clue has ever been found, and Nancy and Crystal both remain missing. Then 3 years later, and 200 miles to the southeast, another soul would vanish into the Appalachian wilderness under equally mysterious circumstances. In March 2012, around the first anniversary of his beloved grandfather's death, 24-year-old Derek Joseph Luing would leave a cryptic note in his car at Newfound Gap and disappear into the Great Smoky Mountains, never to be seen again. The timeline of Derek's disappearance reads like a carefully orchestrated plan that suddenly went awry. On March 17th, he left his Louisville, Tennessee home overnight, and his roommate, Ryan Molden, found Derek's alarm blaring continuously, entirely out of character for the punctual, organized young man. Still, he thought nothing of it at the time, assuming he'd just forgotten to turn it off before leaving for work, but Derek never went to work. Derek would embark on a shopping spree that would suggest serious wilderness preparation. He spent over $1,000 at Bass Pro Shops, Knife Works, which is an incredible store, then Coleman's and Walmart, all on survival gear. He purchased a tent, sleeping bags, maps of the Great Smoky Mountains, a Gerber pack axe, military survival manual pages, 100 feet of black paracord, and a Bear Grylls survival tool pack. Derek was a devoted fan of the Man vs. Wild television show, and it seems as though he was aiming to test what he'd learned. Derek then checked into the Microtel Inn in Cherokee, North Carolina, and hotel surveillance footage captured him leaving alone at 4 a.m. on March 17th, carrying only a small day pack. His family received a call from Ryan stating he hadn't shown up for work, and they immediately drove through the night to try and locate their son, Derek. And what his family found in his room painted a troubling picture. He'd searched the Great Smoky Mountains on his computer shortly before he'd vanished and made a sequence of purchases showing intent to venture out into the wilderness and booked that hotel stay 2 hours away. And the family's next stop was obviously that hotel, where they found a Bible left open on the bed and an empty liquor bottle on the floor of Derek's room. Their next goal was to try and find where he'd gone by checking nearby trailheads for his car. And by 8:30 a.m., Derek's white Ford Escape was discovered by his own family at the Newfound Gap parking area. This point is at an elevation of 5,000 feet, where the Appalachian Trail crosses the Tennessee-North Carolina border here on a map. And inside the vehicle, investigators found a scene that defied some level of logic. They found a handwritten note that simply read, "Don't try to follow me." Some sources report that note said, "Don't look for me." They also found that all his survival gear remained in the car, along with his wallet, credit cards, cash, and car keys. The search effort was immediate and massive, with up to 60 searchers, including 3 dog tracking teams and helicopters, and they scoured over 70 miles of trails covering 56 square miles in total. Teams rappelled down cliff faces and conducted both day and night helicopter searches. The timing, unfortunately, as is with a ton of these cases, could not have been worse. Heavy rains during the initial search period washed away potential scent trails, and despite the sunny weather that had drawn numerous hikers to the park that day, not a single witness reported seeing Derek on any trail. There's no finite end for either the case of Nancy Lockhart or Derek Luing. Aside from the similarity of both going missing and their cases being unsolved, both of these disappearances occur within a geographic and cultural landscape that's steeped in folklore about wild men living in the Appalachian wilderness. Now, it's certainly more likely that these people just maybe went out and got lost or tripped, fell, hypothermia. There's all sorts of very realistic explanations for all of these different things, but it's very difficult to wrap your head around someone just going missing and never being able to find that person ever. And then their body decomposes or whatever, and there's just no trace after a few years or even a year. The wild man thing seems absolutely insane, but there are a ton of people who actually believe it, and there are reports in other cases, specifically the case of Dennis Martin that we've talked about before on the channel, where people said they saw a wild man carrying a small boy. And these stories date back to the 19th century, to 1877, when gold miners in western North Carolina reported encounters with savage humans living in the mountains. This is in the 1800s. Civil War deserters supposedly fled to these remote areas, with theories suggesting their descendants might still inhabit the deepest hollows of Appalachia. And like I mentioned, the 1969 disappearance of 6-year-old Dennis Martin from the Great Smoky Mountains, during which a witness reported seeing a wild man carrying something red over his shoulder, sparked more modern interest in these theories. We did pretty extensively cover that story in a previous video on the channel. There will be a link down in the description below, but it's a perfect tie-in to this topic. There's a consistent, unexplained, and undying legend of people going missing and there not being any real logical cause, or proof of a logical cause, I should say. For a full dive into the story on Dennis Martin, check out that video, but for the sake of this, here is a quick synopsis. June 14th, 1969, you have a little boy, Dennis Lloyd Martin, 7 years old. He disappears at Spence Field in Cades Cove, a part of the Great Smoky Mountains. And it's important, he disappears while planning to play a playful sneak attack on his parents. 4 hours pass before rangers are notified of the disappearance. A massive search then launches involving thousands of man hours. The FBI comes involved due to the bizarre nature of the case. 60 Green Berets join the search operation, and the Martin family offers a $5,000 reward for information despite the extensive efforts. Dennis is never found. Around the same time as Dennis' appearance, a fellow by the name of Harold Key and his family are hiking about 10 miles away, and Key and his sons hear a terrible scream while looking for bears near a creek bed. They walk about 200 yards towards the sound, and they see what initially appears to be a bear, but upon closer inspection, they realize it's a rough-looking man hiding in the bushes trying to avoid them. Key's wife in their parked car also hears the scream, and Key reports the sighting after learning of Dennis's disappearance. Then we go to 1985, when a ginseng hunter reported finding a scattered child skeleton and the remains of that in Tremont's Big Hollow, about 15 miles northeast of Spence Field. The fella who discovered the remains delayed his reporting for years due to fear of prosecution for illegal ginseng harvesting, a massive thing in the 80s in Appalachia. And by the time it's finally reported, the remains could never be located again, and the Dennis case remains one of the most famous unsolved disappearances in national park history. The number of cases that dodge traditional explanations and remain unsolved, and that may fit into this feral man theory, is pretty staggering if you're inclined to believe that something lurks in the shadows, waiting for the opportunity to catch someone alone in the wilderness. A lot of people believe that. I personally do not believe it, and I feel that mental health is probably one of the main things that is involved with people going missing. I don't feel like serial killers are responsible for everything. I think children can get lost, and so on and so forth. A ton of very boring things, but it's important to talk about different theories and what people believe and what people have found and the evidence that people propose. Roughly 12 years after the disappearance of Dennis Lloyd Martin on September 25th, 1981, Thelma Pauline Melton, a 58-year-old woman who went by Polly, was last seen hiking in the Deep Creek area of the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. She was part of a group, including her husband and some friends who had parked an Airstream in a campground, presumably at the Deep Creek campground, but not far from the trailhead. And at 4 p.m., Polly was walking with her friends when she vanished. Her husband had stayed behind at the campground while Polly and her friends hit the trail. Polly was familiar with this trail, and according to her friends, she had sped up, getting ahead of her companions, and she'd walked over a hill out of view. And about 30 minutes after she disappeared over the hill, the rest of the group arrived back at the campground, presuming that they'd find Polly there, but her husband hadn't seen her. And at 6 p.m., 2 hours after her disappearance, she'd been reported missing to park rangers. No evidence of Polly venturing off the path was ever found, so what could have possibly happened? According to the Charlie Project, a database of disappearance cold cases, Polly was grieving the recent passing of her mother, but still, she wasn't believed to be suicidal despite recent bouts of depression as a result of the passing of her mom. She could have willingly stepped off the path or something, but doing anything without there being any evidence left behind is difficult to understand. Now, the area where Dennis Lloyd Martin went missing in 1969 and where Polly went missing in 1981 are very far away from one another. They're both in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, but Spence Field, where Dennis went missing, is in the central west area of the park, whilst Deep Creek is on the very southern end on the North Carolina side of the park. It's a distance of about 25 to 35 miles on foot. This is still a very close proximity for such a strange and bizarre disappearance to happen within such a short period of time, which has led people to speculate about wild men, feral people of Appalachia. People think it's Bigfoot. That's one of the main official explanations of missing 411, serial killers, and all of that. One more disappearance in the region may even be seen as speculative evidence of the feral men theory, one that fell between the two in time as well as geographically. 7 years after Dennis vanished and 5 years before Polly would do the same, on October 8th, 1976, a school group from Berridon High School in Knoxville, Tennessee was in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park on a hiking trip. They were on their return stretch of the hike, heading back to the Kauai parking area where they would load up into their bus and head back home. And the group, led by ornamental horticulture teacher Wayne Dunlap, was coming along Andrews Bald Trail when one student in the group, Teresa Trenny Gibson, vanished. This was in the area around Clingman's Dome, which is the highest point in the park, positioned along the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. They were only a half a mile from the parking area when Teresa went missing. It seems very unlikely for her to go missing in a school group. There were 38 other students on the trip, which broke into smaller groups based on their different hiking pace. They had very clear instructions from their supervising teacher, Mr. Dunlap, not to hike past Andrews Bald or take any side trails. And I just couldn't imagine getting lost. You'd have to try really hard or go off the beaten path with like someone else. It's very surprising with all the different groups of kids. Kids like to stick together. Trenny hiked to Andrews Bald, the mountain peak south of the Kauai Visitor Center that they'd arrived at, alongside the student she'd ridden beside on the bus, a kid by the name of Robert Simpson. But Trenny took the return trip to the parking lot alone, and with there being various smaller groups of students, she eventually came up behind a group consisting of Angela Beckner, Lisa Mickles, and Bobby Cogill. It's a girl. They reported that she was walking faster than they were and that she proceeded past most of them, but Bobby kept pace with Trenny. The two would catch up to another pair of students, Scott Troy and Anita Rounds, and the group continued together for a few minutes before Scott, Anita, and Bobby took a seat to rest for a bit, and then Trenny decided to continue on her own. Then Scott, Anita, and Bobby would watch Trenny continue and see her stop on the path, bend over, then turn off the trail. And with more groups behind and ahead of them, the trio of students who watched Trenny disappear didn't think anything of it until they arrived at the bus where they assumed she'd be, only she was not. And when Trenny didn't arrive at the bus, Wayne Dunlap, the teacher, hiked back to Andrews Bald with another student, Danny Johnson, trying to locate her, but they couldn't find her, and the National Park Service was contacted and informed of a missing child in the park. Park Services immediately launched a search, and the bus with the remaining 38 students went back to Knoxville, but Wayne Dunlap stayed behind to assist in the search for his missing student. I cannot imagine how responsible he felt in that time. The Park Service logs documenting the timeline of the search for Trenny from the day she went missing and after reveal that the Rangers felt an urgent need to find Trenny the same day that she disappeared. As every single day someone stays missing, the chances of them being found alive drastically decrease. Not to mention there was rain, it was cold, and it was wet in the area where she had vanished, with heavy rain in the forecast for that night, with temperatures dropping down to the mid-30s. So truly a treacherous environment to get lost in. Trenny's parents were instructed to bring some of her dirty clothing for search dogs to get her scent, but most of the manpower for the search wouldn't arrive until the next morning. Unfortunately, looking back at all this research and information, it appeared that none of the students thought it was pertinent to share what they'd witnessed the day that Trenny disappeared, and it wasn't until the next day that one of the students reported seeing her leave the trail. And unfortunately, Trenny Gibson was never found. And as time passed, Trenny's family and the public would start to believe that it couldn't have just been a matter of getting lost in the park, but potentially a kidnapper or murderer or some evil thing like that. Some maintenance staff at the time circulated a rumor that she had run off with her boyfriend to Bill Ryan, who showed up for a TV interview. And on the 12th, someone called in a tip that Trenny had boarded a plane with a much older, heavy-set man. So there's just information all over the place. Trenny's father would also perpetuate the belief that there was foul play involved, and a paper ran in 1989 where Trenny's father shared that he had hoped a TV show would help find answers where there had been none before. And also in this article that ran in 1989, it shared that Trenny didn't date, seemingly to dispel the notion that she'd run off with a boyfriend or older man. And a $5,000 reward was even offered if anyone could provide information leading to the arrest and conviction of anyone involved in the disappearance of Trenny Gibson. There's a ton of possibilities to assume here, and the Gibson family claimed that the family had received threats from an anonymous individual the year before Trenny vanished, and even Ted Bundy at the time was questioned about Trenny. However, it was believed that he had no involvement in this case specifically, but I have no idea what happened. I obviously have no idea what happened. I wasn't there. I didn't do it. There's plenty of assumptions to make and speculation, and Reddit and the internet is great at that. Maybe it was a feral person. One person shared their perspective on Reddit, so obviously we have to take this story with a grain of salt, but the post is titled, "I live in the Great Smoky Mountain and I know what snatches children." The poster claims to be a lifelong resident of the North Carolina side of the mountains and says that ever since the 30s, feral wild men have lived in the mountains. They're fast, they steal livestock, they steal children, they speak their own language, and they live underground. This person also claims the FBI knows about them but does nothing, and they say locals know not to go into the woods at night and not to venture off the trails. Otherwise, you could end up like Dennis Martin or some other kid who was involved in an unsolved missing case. At night, you can hear the inbred ferals hollering in the Great Smoky Mountains. Replies to this post are obviously quite divided. Some share that they hear similar stories or believe it to be a possible reality given the scale of the Smoky Mountains and the difficult terrain and the surrounding forests, and others say it's very far-fetched in an era with thermal imaging, drones, and cameras. Everybody has a phone and a camera. And there's a bunch of people also that say they live there or know people who lived in the region but have never encountered anything, which I didn't live in the Smoky Mountains, but I lived in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I never saw a single feral man. I'm gonna be real with you guys. Didn't see a single feral guy. I did see on a fence post one time, this seems not real, by the way, but this is a totally real story. My friends and I were going to the quarry in Front Royal, Virginia. I think that's illegal to say, but we were going to the quarry, and there is a train track you follow to go to the quarry, to go swim in the quarry. Very safe, very, very safe, genius. And we walk up to these train tracks, and there's, at the bottom of the train tracks, a bunch of needles and disgusting shit. So we're walking down the train tracks, and there's this little thing on the side of the train track. It's like a little area with a box on it, a metal box, I guess electrical box or something like that, and it's just off the side of the train tracks. We walk up to it, go read it. It's me, my friend Wyatt, and my ex-girlfriend, I'm pretty sure, and some other people. I forget exactly, but on the back of the box, it says, "Remember Lobo," and then it says, "There he is, the one who killed me." And we read this, and we're like, oh, that's creepy. And then we turn around, and there is a guy with a wolf dog thing, a huge, gigantic wolf dog, there's a real dog called a wolf dog, and it looks like that. It's a huge dog though, massive, gigantic, extremely old and decrepit dog. And there's also all these legends from where I'm from at Front Royal about this the wolf man who kills people and all this shit, and all there's a murderer and there's bodies found and all this stuff. I don't know nothing about it. I haven't done any research now that I'm thinking about it, but for some reason this popped into my head while recording this off the cuff. That's my closest association to a feral person, a random vagrant with a huge dog that appeared behind us as we read something about somebody getting murdered. So, closest thing I've ever seen. And do I think it's likely that this is what is happening to these people? I don't think so, to be honest, guys. It would be really interesting and make for a good horror movie, but life is often quite boring. This video is sponsored by Factor. You don't have to pretend to enjoy cooking every single night. There are other alternatives. You don't have to make the grocery store runs every single night. I used to do it all, and then I got lazy. And thankfully, Factor exists and makes delicious, chef-crafted, healthy meals that do all of that for me. And now I get fresh, never frozen meals delivered right to my front door. They're ready to just be heated up in 2 minutes. And I can slurp them down. And I may look like a funny guy, but I'm not even joking with you. I usually go for the protein plus ones and then the really delicious ones. But they got keto, they got vegan, they got everything you need pretty much. It's been a pretty big game changer for my schedule. I don't waste as much time cooking. I got something I want you to do. Go to factor75.com or click the link in the description. Use code 50OOMPA to get 50% off your first Factor box. That's code 50OOMPA at factor75.com. 50% off plus free shipping. It's bullshit, to be honest. How do they even afford that? I have a business and I don't know how they would ever afford that, but. So anyways, back to the video. The claim that these people live underground is worth some investigation because that's a common theme among these different wild legends and conspiracy theories. Plus, there are many cave systems throughout the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, some of which you can visit and many of which you cannot. Probably because they're unsafe, but also because they don't want you to go there because they're hiding. No, it's because they're very unsafe, I'm sure. Included in these underground networks are 2 old copper mining sites that were abandoned in the 1940s. And these mines, Eagle Creek and Sugar Fork, produced a staggering 83 million pounds of copper from 1926 to 1944 before shutting down. Both are semi-fenced off, but someone dedicated could still access them if they chose to, but the mines are considered unstable and safety risks. These sites have historically attracted visitors who dare to test their luck against a collapsing mine shaft. In the 2000s, a lot of these mine shafts were closed up with blasts or completely secured to prevent people from going in because plenty of spelunkers, crazy people went in and died. Not in these specifically, but just in America in general. Another thing to consider is the Bigfoot conspiracy, the Bigfoot explanation, the interdimensional Sasquatch. Like, a lot of people say that actually genuinely seriously. I feel like feral humans or wild men are more likely than Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I mean, feral humans and wild men resemble Sasquatch and Bigfoot. I mean, there's so many sightings of the Bigfoot across so many different regions, but like, people are real, and I've seen some really hairy giant dudes, so it seems more likely. Needless to say, the wildman folklore is persistent and compelling because people are wild, people are crazy. There are people who live in society who murder. Imagine just being cut off from society. We can admit that there are people in Appalachia especially who are completely cut off and isolated from society. Take that a step further and you've got Sasquatch, essentially. And if we take a step back in time, we have the Civil War that shattered the Appalachian region, sending deserters and draft dodgers fleeing into the wilderness during the time. And by 1871, stories of feral men took on flesh and blood near Morgantown when a squad of citizens captured what local newspapers called a creature that was half man and half beast. Thomas Foley, an Irish immigrant who claimed to have fled Connecticut 2 years earlier, had survived in the West Virginia wilderness with long bushy hair, giving him the appearance of a gorilla more than a human being. And what happened next would become a pattern repeated throughout Appalachian wild man lore. When concerned citizens clothed Foley and offered him shelter, he waited for his chance, then burst free, tearing off the civilized garments as he sprinted back to his mountain refuge. And Foley's case emerged during what would seem like an epidemic of wild men sightings following the Civil War, as men who had once been civilized turned to the wilderness. One such man was named Bill Patton, and Patton had supposedly fought forced recruitment for the Civil War and suffered a wound to the head before making his escape. and the wound made him mad, and he fled into the wilderness after this. And his time in the wilderness is where Bill Patton would become the wild man that he is remembered as. General Braxton Bragg of the Confederacy would have 5 soldiers go missing, leaving behind signs of a struggle. A party of 10 men would eventually find the wild man formerly known as Bill Patton, and while they were initially able to capture him, they could not communicate with him. So they let him go and they followed him back to his cave, where he then noticed them following him again, and he fled in a chase that ultimately led to him choosing to leap 100 feet to his death over being captured once again by the party. And the men were supposedly unharmed in the cave, so he didn't really fight back. He was more of a, what are those things called? A lemur? No, a leper? No, a lemming. But it turns out that damn Animal Channel ran them things off the cliff though, right? Some of these so-called wild men are not identifiable or were never seen again after one particular sighting. On a cold March evening in 1919, Luther C. Douglas left a lodge meeting near Ed Wiley's barn in the Flatwoods area of Braxton County in West Virginia. And what happened next would establish this remote region as the epicenter of West Virginia's wild man phenomenon for the next century. As Douglas passed an abandoned house, a wild-looking fellow in rags with long hair and a beard burst through the front door, brandishing a huge knotted club and uttering the most horrifying sounds. Those are all quotes from this fella. And Douglas, a man not easily frightened, drew his revolver and fired 2 shots. The creature fled into the darkness, screaming louder than ever. The Evening Telegram's coverage revealed a community gripped by fear. The belief that a wild man is still lurking in this vicinity, stealing and killing children and young pigs, is stronger than ever just now, is what they said. I'm sure that's how people sounded. And nobody ever officially found the wild man of Flatwoods, obviously. Flatwoods is known for the Flatwoods Monster, too, and Bigfoot. And as the 20th century progressed, West Virginia's wild man legends took new shape as disappearances from the 1800s to the early 1900s, to the middle, to the end, they all continued. Robert Kovak, an architecture student at Virginia Tech University, disappeared after last being seen in mid-September of 1998. He'd been seen taking $80 from an ATM near his school campus with plans to head home to his parents' house in Rivesville, West Virginia, which is about a 4-hour trip and 240-mile trek. And an hour before withdrawing the extra cash, he'd filled up his gas tank, which roughly would have been able to get him perfectly to his parents, about 240 miles worth. The 1997 Geo Tracker that he drove had roughly 11-gallon gas tank and got 22 miles to the gallons. That's 242 miles on an empty tank from full to empty, so it's completely possible. But rather than make it home, he seemed to have completely vanished. And his geo-tracker was discovered days later, located in what is now the New River Gorge National Park and Preserve. And the New River Gorge is less than halfway into the trip, which makes it a pretty unusual place to stop, unless you're there to take in the view, which is perfectly plausible. I've stopped there a couple times before. The most bizarre part of this case is that his car was out of gas, which is weird if he was headed directly to his parents, but perhaps that hour time gap between the ATM withdrawal and the fill-up played a role in some fuel expenditure or something along those lines, but still doesn't necessarily make up the full journey and running out of fuel. It's confusing. But this is just the start in what would become many details that make little sense in Robert's disappearance. The ATM he withdrew cash from was at a credit union on South Main Street in Blacksburg, Virginia, while the gas station was on North Main Street, only 2 miles away from each other. And of course, all this could be as simple as Robert didn't completely fill his tank at the gas station, but when preparing for a long trip, it makes sense to make sure you have a full tank to avoid unnecessary stops, just kind of common sense. And there's more details we'll soon discuss that raise even more interesting questions. Rob was reportedly seen shortly after his ATM withdrawal back on campus by a fellow architecture student, a person by the name of Catherine Porzio, and she'd seen an exhausted-looking Rob marked by puffy eyes hanging low with dark bags, and he'd asked her how she was doing, but the two had no further conversation. She was reportedly the last person to see Robert Kovak before his disappearance, as no one has ever come forward with an interaction between Porzios and when he vanished. And moving back to the geo-tracker, when it was found, it was locked, but his personal belongings were missing from the inside, including his clothes. The vehicle had been accessed via a slit in its soft top canvas, so someone forced their way into it, potentially. There's a possibility that maybe he locked his keys before this happened and gained entry through that. I know people who have entered a soft top that way because they forget their keys. But also a police theory was that rafters on the river below may have seen the car sitting for days, at which point they made their entrance and stole from the vehicle, which that also happens quite a bit. But could it have been something else? We have no idea. The geo-tracker model owned by Rob could be switched between two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive, like a classic geo-tracker style. Supposedly, Rob had learned to drive in a four-wheel drive stick shift in Rivesville, so he should have been entirely familiar with the operation of the vehicle, but when it was found, it was in four-wheel drive rather than the two-wheel drive, which would have made sense for the journey that he'd intended to go on. So you don't generally just drive around with your hubs locked, four-wheel low on the mount. Like, it doesn't really make any sense. But Michael Kovak, Robert's brother, speculated that it might not have been an accident. It's hard not to assume foul play when there's just no answers to a story. Michael said, "My theory on that, and it is just a theory, is that something happened in Blacksburg. Somebody that knew my brother knew where he was from and just drove the vehicle as far north as they could go. You go in four-wheel drive because you'll run out of gas much quicker," which that absolutely does make sense. And potentially backing up this foul play theory from Michael is the fact that the geo-tracker was found half a mile past the nearest gas station on the route. So why go past it unless you didn't want to reach your destination? It's pretty hard to run out of gas. There's plenty of gas stations around. There's not really giant swaths of dead zone where you can't get fuel in Appalachia, to be honest. Plenty of country stores. I tell you what. Assuming Rob was the one driving, he would have known better than to drive long distance in four-wheel drive, and likely would have stopped to refill if he'd realized that he was low on fuel. It just doesn't make a lot of sense for someone who's in any way responsible to fall into that predicament. There was briefly some speculation he may have off-roaded due to the grime that was built up on the exterior of the car, but that was later attributed to splash from passing vehicles while his car had sat. Also, let's suppose someone had something to do with his disappearance. Michael Kovak also outlines how they would have had a hard time making a victim out of Robert. Robert was a tall, lanky guy. He was 6'3", 175 pounds. He looked thin and made him maybe appear to be an easier victim than he actually would have been. And his brother described him as scrappy, someone who wouldn't back down in a fight. And that the two of them had been in several fights growing up together. So there's absolutely, he could stand on his own for sure. For days, the area around Robert's vehicle had been searched with no results. Searchers brought in cadaver dogs, they used helicopters, and scoured the area under the New River Gorge Bridge for signs of Robert. He would remain missing for nearly 2 decades until March 2016. A work crew was working beneath the New River Gorge Bridge, clear-cutting the area with heavy equipment to prepare for bridge construction. And during the clearing of dense vegetation below the bridge on one of the steepest slopes, they uncovered human skeletal remains. The discovery of the remains was not far from where Robert Kovak's geo-tracker had been located, which makes the reception of the discovery difficult to understand for some people, because how could you go missing and be found so close to where you went missing, and through all that search and everything, you just couldn't find the person? It's tough to understand. Michael, Robert's brother, seemed completely understanding of the inability to find his brother. He said it's easy as an outsider looking in. Why didn't they find this? Why didn't they find that? Unless you've been in the terrain and been in the area, it's easy to cast those stones. That totally makes sense. It's such a crazy area. Robert's roommate, Colin Smith, who had been a part of this search, expressed dismay at the discovery, but also was understanding because he's an Appalachian fella. He said, "Tons of us were just walking through the woods in 1998, but that wasn't very fruitful. It's disappointing to hear that nothing came out of the effort, but it's like searching for a needle in a haystack at some point." And while some of the most important people in the story, like Robert's brother, are totally understanding of the search never finding anything until it was completely cleared, it still doesn't answer the question, what happened to him? What exactly led to him getting to that point? The New River Gorge Bridge is one of the tallest bridges in the US and is the site of a festival called Bridge Day. And every October, hundreds of people base jump or rappel from the bridge. In the period between Robert Kovak's disappearance and when he was found, more than 4 dozen bodies had been recovered from beneath the bridge, making it even more startling that he was never found during any of these previous searches. Julie Rosenberger, a woman who briefly dated Robert, found it all a bit too out of the ordinary. She said, "There were a lot of people. You would think that would be one of the places they would look. And when a body starts to decompose, the cadaver dogs would have found it. It's just weird. All of it is weird. And Robert's father, also named Michael Kovak, still doesn't believe that things add up either. He said, if you made a trip 50 times and you knew where the gas station was, would you run out of gas? That's what I'm saying. That's what he said, not what I'm saying. But that's completely true. I mean, people just don't run out of gas. To me, it makes more sense that the car was left, he had a horrible accident, and then insane people broke into his vehicle and siphoned his fuel. That's possible. Regardless, it's another disappearance in Appalachia that we can't quite say for sure how or why it happened, and we can only loosely speculate. It is yet another story that ends with more questions and zero closure. In Appalachia, the line between truth and tale have always been pretty thin. When a man vanishes without a trace, or even when his bones are eventually found, your mind drifts to dark places on the map. This extremely human nature is where conspiracy theories take root. There's whispers and legends and stories and tales of people living beyond society's reach, pharaoh families, inbred clans, wild men lurking in the timberline. These things grow louder with every single unsolved case. It's just wild speculation. I think particularly what causes the interest in Appalachia comes from a reflection of something that is extremely real and extremely human. The Appalachian Mountains have always been a land apart. When Scotch, Irish, German, and English settlers began trickling into the region in the 1730s, they found a landscape of parallel ridges and deep valleys that created natural barriers to communication and commerce, natural isolation. While residents of urban and suburban areas have close access, if not immediate access, and have for a long time, to basic services necessary to developing a society. You have schools, jobs, transportation hubs, healthcare facilities, all of these amazing luxuries urban areas have access to. Many rural parts of Appalachia haven't for a long time, and they've been largely forgotten by a system. You can call the area a victim of over-industrialization for mining or whatever. You can also link the issue to the incredible mountain ranges, the valleys and woodlands as far as the eye can see. There is some pretty uninhabitable terrain and environment in Appalachia, and it just never stops. It goes on for so long. The Appalachian region is massive. For some areas of Appalachia, one may need to drive as long as an hour to reach the nearest medical care facility. In West Virginia still, man. Where I used to live in Front Royal, the closest big hospital is in Winchester, which is this Valley Health thing. It's a huge facility. It's super high tech. That's in Northern Virginia. Most everybody in a huge radius in West Virginia, if you just draw a massive circle around Winchester, that's the closest hospital that they have that actually can care for them. And it is difficult to get there. If you try to drive 50 west at night and it's foggy, I mean, we're still talking about civilized land, and you can barely get to a hospital in time for an emergency. So I can't imagine in the 70s, 80s, 50s, 60s, 40s, 20s, 10s, whatever. I mean, we're so fortunate now to be able to have what we have, and still there's just a level of apathy, it seems, from like the rest of America to this area in terms of society. It's really strange and difficult to pinpoint exactly what's going on. Needless to say, there are many Appalachian communities that are still quite isolated, and especially in the 20th century, there were tons that were entirely isolated. Families and people who decided to be self-reliant rather than needing to rely on facilities that are both far and costly. And once again, you take a step back in time, and all of this separation and isolation is just exponentially more strong. And once again, you take a step back in time, and the strength of this isolation is exponential. Fortunately, the National Park Service's historical documentation shows that some of these early communities in Appalachia developed as scattered and self-sufficient island communities, which is a real term, divided by ridges and hills, with only a few passes like the famous Cumberland Gap providing access between valleys of these different communities. With the many small settlements that popped up formed around similarities they shared, such as shared belief systems and religious sects. Religious sects, not religious sects. And the geographic reality of their new home meant that by 1900, population density in core Appalachian regions averaged just 35 people per square mile. And some counties like Rabun in Georgia and Leslie in Kentucky had fewer than 20 people per square mile. That is unbelievable. And that's in the area of industrialization and mass growth, when the USA is becoming this huge powerhouse of the world, and the rest of the world is growing rapidly, but with roads that were like paths in Appalachia as recently as the 90s. Even there's places, you go to Yellow Springs, bud, I tell you what, some bitch, you probably not even be able to use credit card. hard up there. Just kidding. That's bullshit. Yellow Springs is really nice. But you about 15 minutes west, Buchanan up there, turn the 2x4 into Banana. Man, you can't fucking get your goddamn fucking credit card and working up there. Tell you what, you run for city council. Get you a chicken farm. I know a guy who has a chicken farm and ran for city council. He's on the city council. Anyways, self-sufficient farms continued to dominate Appalachia as they were the most reliable method of survival for many of the mountain settlements. And many communities were almost entirely cut off from the outside world until railroads arrived in the 1880s, but even when those began to spring up, they were far from many of the most isolated groups. These mountaineers had little to no cash or way to transact with society. The isolation bred self-sufficiency by necessity. Mountain farmers produced up to 90% of the products that were needed by these communities, relying on corn cultivation, hog raising, hunting, and just gathering and spending time together and creating genuine communities. Bartering is universal, and cash was less valuable and was only needed when interacting with merchants or outsiders. And even merchants would extend credit to mountaineers or work with them in the form of barter, which is awesome. And during the time of the Civil War, liquor taxes made legal distilling unprofitable, and moonshine production in the area flourished in these hidden hollers, adding another layer to the region's reputation for isolation and lawlessness and just general separation from mainstream society. Moonshine was one of the only industries that mountaineers could undertake. They could barter or sell corn that they grew, but it was hard to transport on the underdeveloped roads, and refining it down to moonshine made it easier to contain in a drug, and then you just run away, run from the cops, sell it to people, sell it to idiots in the urban areas, make them go blind. That was a primary revenue source from many communities, and removing that revenue source through taxes and the law was devastating. Communities further withdrew into isolation as moonshining led to feuding and bloodshed between settlements. And this is where things come somewhat full circle to the discussion of wild man stories, and specifically those during the Civil War. The period following the Civil War saw a remarkable surge in such sightings across America in general, with Appalachian regions featuring prominently in newspaper accounts that were reprinted nationwide. But of course, Americans and the Europeans that settled America weren't the first to tell stories of mysterious forest dwellers. We have stories of these feral people from the Cherokee Creek and Seminole peoples all have long traditions of hairy people or humanoid forest spirits. The Cherokee spoke of these, or little people, which were knee-high nature spirits with long hair who were helpful and kind-hearted but would vanish forever if you offended them. They also told cautionary tales of this, or Booger, a hairy humanoid monster that lurked in the shadows near places that were frequented by children. I'm starting to notice a trend here. Hairy beasts and children are kind of at odds with one another. As documented by folklore researchers, two strands of folklore began to intertwine and influence each other, creating a new kind of legend, a Bigfoot legend that blended elements of both native and settler culture. The crucial difference lies in the interpretation. Native peoples understood these beings as spiritual entities with moral and educational significance, and Europeans interpreted the stories as descriptions of actual beasts, physical creatures, degraded humans who had devolved through their rejection of civilized society. Wild men! This core misunderstanding would shape how isolated individuals in general were perceived for generations to come. And of course, not all stories of unusual mountain dwellers are pure folklore. The Blue Fugates of Kentucky represented one of the most striking examples of how extreme isolation could produce genuinely startling physical conditions. You've probably seen some of these images before, but the story goes as follows. Martin Fugate and Elizabeth Smith settled near Hazard, Kentucky around 1820. And due to an incredibly rare genetic coincidence, both carried a recessive gene for this, methemoglobinemia, a condition that reduces the blood's ability to carry oxygen and turns the skin blue. This was an area of Kentucky that had no roads, and a railroad wasn't available until the 1910s. So the prospects for marriage and reproduction were pretty few. The gene pool is kind of small, so the Fugates began marrying and having children with people within their own bloodline, Great Britain style. 4 of their 9 children exhibited blue skin as their condition persisted into future generations. That's an example of something a European settler from the 1700s might think of as some kind of beast, some kind of smurf or something along those lines. But moving ahead, the economic catastrophe of the 1930s created new waves of extreme isolation in Appalachia as coal mines closed and timber companies companies pulled out. Entire communities were completely abandoned. Some families, too poor or too proud to leave ancestral lands, retreated deeper into the mountains. And it's during this period that our modern legends of feral people began to take their form. Some of these descendants and communities supposedly developed their languages and then lived underground, which there's no credible evidence for such underground colonies of inbred Appalachian people, but the Great Depression did absolutely create genuine cases of extreme isolation that still persist today. Take, for example, the internet spectacle of the Whitaker family of Odd, West Virginia. You guys have definitely seen some of this. This family represents perhaps the most documented modern case of just extreme isolation in Appalachia. The Whitakers are known thanks to their extensive history with a guy named Mark, a YouTuber behind the YouTube channel Soft White Underbelly, who makes a bunch of really interesting documentary-style content. He's been a friend, an advocate, and a supporter of the family for years. It's very impressive what he's done, and he seems like genuinely a really nice guy. Living in a community of just 360 people, 75 miles from Charleston, the family's multi-generational isolation and history of internal marriages dating back to the 1800s have resulted in disabilities which are both physical and mental, as well as nonverbalism, as some members of the family communicate primarily through pointing or speech that is more like grunting or the sound similar to a dog barking.
Do you miss him? Do you miss your brother?
It's real, and it's sad, and it's very f***ed up, but that is absolute reality. And these living conditions reflect not supernatural de-evolution, but the harsh reality of generational poverty in one of America's most economically disadvantaged regions, where it has been identified that potentially up to a third of homes may have contaminants in water, with one particularly smaller scale study of 9 homes detecting E. coli in 3 of them. So it's just all around really bad, and there's a lot to be done to help behind the scenes. Be good to people. There's a lot worse out there. You could be way worse off, whether it's in Appalachia or anywhere else in the world that you can think of. That is an example of currently worse than your situation right now. You watching me on your phone, just scrolling, DoorDash, you lucky. What are you doing? Hopefully thinking. So feral people. The internet loves the idea of the legend of feral people. The most influential modern iteration, I would say, of feral people began once again on Reddit in 2015 when user u/search and rescue woods posted an 8-part series titled, "I'm a search and rescue officer for the US Forest Service. I have some stories to tell." The stories, featuring mysterious staircases in the woods and supernatural encounters, were presented as real experiences on r/no sleep, where the rule is that everything is true even if it isn't. So it's creepypasta. It's not real. It's fake. Just kidding, it's totally real. But the stories went viral, spawning their own subreddit and inspiring countless imitators. And the success of this demonstrated how digital platforms could amplify and authenticate folklore through pseudo-documentary presentation. And by the time TikTok arrived, the template was set. Present extraordinary claims as personal testimony, add just enough specific detail for viewers to suspend disbelief, and let the algorithm do the rest, guys. As an example, a TikTok from JBaby96 posted in 2021 talks about the feral people living in our national parks eating people, and how now national parks are off limit due to the risk, even if incredibly unlikely, of falling victim to one of these feral cannibals. This person literally thinks that there are feral cannibals in the national parks. This TikTok blew up, of course. 5 million views and 1 million likes, because 1/5 of all those people are like, yeah! Feral cannibals in West Virginia? Yeah! One of the top comments suggests looking up Dennis Lloyd Martin if you're not convinced, and Jay responds saying it's the first case that she looked at. It is a very sensational idea that draws on the mystery of the massive number of disappearances, which are absolutely real in national parks. People go missing all the time, and it does tickle a level of curiosity of people who believe in things like Bigfoot. And the feral people thing, to be fair, is an idea that is more grounded in reality. People more skeptical of Bigfoot may also consider listening to this or watching, because it's like the same level of, what the fuck, crazy white people in the woods, hairy white people. It's like still crazy, but it's not a mythical monster that there is no proof of whatsoever. So the stories get shared and spread with creators with large platforms, etc. And then we talk about it like it's real or something like that. But it's a digital game of telephone that inflates and spreads legends like wildfire. And it is fun, to be honest, but I think it makes people kind of dumb. I feel like it makes people kind of dumb. I feel like the whole true crime thing, it's like, I've got crime brain now. I think murderers are everywhere. I feel like, but I don't think that. I don't think that at all, dude. I look at a tree and I see the beauty of the tree. I look at a tree, I don't think somebody's gonna murder me. I look at the tree and I see the bark of the tree and I wanna like hug it. Is that weird? I always thought tree huggers were commies when I was growing up, but now I get it, dude. I really get it. I see the beauty in life and I get it, and you should too. You don't have to get it, but just see the beauty in life. So anyways, all this stuff is very fun and very entertaining, and the legend is there and all this stuff, and having a strong emotional response is super fun, and sensation is very fun and all this stuff, but like also there's a 99% chance that there is a realistic explanation for these things.